Hello and welcome to the Aviation Briefing with me, William Hallowell. In this podcast series, I speak with industry and media colleagues about the biggest stories in aviation and also the biggest topics. Today, I've got two guests with me. I've got Timothy Loranger, who is a civil law attorney and pilot, and Daniel Bubb, who is also a pilot and an aviation historian and author. Hello to you both.
Good morning.
Hello.
It's great to have
you for having us.
It's great to have you guys. And today's topic, obviously, we're going to be talking about the Alaska Airlines incident that took place on Friday. It's been a very interesting start for aviation, hasn't it, for the beginning of this year? You know, we're only 11 days in. We've had the Japan Airlines crash before. And as I say, on Friday, we've had the Alaska Airlines incident. If I could start with you, Dan, could you give us a brief overview of what's happened so far, the investigation that's been ongoing, and potentially any updates that we're in the process of getting to understand?
Okay. Sure, absolutely. Yes, thank you for having us this morning. So to date, as we know, an Alaska Airlines 737 MAX 9 had a plug door that became disengaged with the airplane. And the plane was at 16,000 feet. They were traveling at about 443 miles per hour. And of course, the oxygen mask deployed as they were designed to do. And the pilots declared an emergency, came back around to Portland International Airport and landed the airplane safely with everybody on board. And so obviously, this created a very serious concern about the safety of this aircraft. To date, the FAA has grounded 171 MAX 9s so that the planes can be inspected for if this is a design flaw, is it an installation flaw, something like that. United and Alaska have had to cancel numerous flights because they use the MAX 9. So they're kind of waiting right now to see what is happening. Is this something that's going to take considerable time to fix? Is it going to be about a 4 to 8 hour window as they're recommending right now? So that's kind of where we're waiting to see what happens with the NTSB and the FAA's investigation.
Okay, and if we're going to kind of think about the investigation so far, what can we expect to find out potentially in the coming days, weeks? I mean, potentially we're going to be looking at a big report that's going to come out in, I presume, several months' time. What can we expect to know then?
Sure. So the NTSB and the FAA are going to do a very thorough investigation. They're going to obviously meet with people from Boeing to find out what happened. They're going to meet with people from Spirit Aerospace Systems, which I believe is the manufacturer of those plug doors. And they're going to talk to everybody involved. They want to find out what happened. Was this an improper installation? Is it a design flaw? So it's going to be very thorough, and we will know within a matter of months what happened. And then there will be recommendations from that. Do the airlines still need to keep the planes grounded? Are they going to have to redesign this plug door? So those are the things that we will find out in the coming months with the final report.
So, Tim, if I could now turn to you, in terms of the impact this is going to have, not just on the wider aviation industry, but I suppose scrutiny. Not that I want to draw you on a blame game, but I mean, are Alaska Airlines and Boeing going to be potentially under the under the thumb at the moment, or is it a case of it's not actually a blame game, but just something has gone wrong with the aircraft?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. What we're going to try and find out, or what the NTSB is going to find out, is what was the cause of this failure in the plug door. And as Dan said, I agree with everything that Dan said. The question is this an issue that occurred during the manufacturing process of the aircraft? With regard to this particular aircraft, I think it was relatively new. It was delivered to Alaska Airlines in October of 2023. It seems like this may be an issue that happened on the assembly line of the aircraft. So perhaps what they have to go look at are some of the quality assurance procedures that they have. The door is installed, the bolts for the door are tightened to a certain value, torqued, and then somebody has to come along and make sure that's done properly. Maybe there was a breakdown in that process. Or as Dan said, there may be a design issue. It could be that they did everything right during the manufacturing process, but it wasn't engineered properly so that the door over a short period of time apparently started to become unreliable, and then there was a failure. So let me just go back to your particular question. Who would be responsible for that? They would look very much at Boeing and its processes. They would look at Spirit Aero Systems, who I think made the door. Alaska Airlines it owns the aircraft. It is ultimately responsible for the safety of its flight. Those are the main entities I think that they would look to.
So the Boeing chief has already admitted that there's been a lapse in quality control. I mean, that's extraordinary, isn't it? Because aviation, we all know that safety for passengers and everybody on board an aircraft is paramount. For the chief of Boeing to come out and say that is actually quite extraordinary. I mean, is that a damning indictment of slipping safety standards or something else?
Well, certainly safety standards are a big concern. And the big question is, why is that happening? What's happening at Boeing that creates an environment where these standards start to slip? There's nothing more important in aviation, in the assembly and manufacture of these aircraft than safety. So why is that happening? What is the concern that they are focused on that is more important than safety? Is that the budget? Is that profit margin? Those are the kinds of things that we're concerned about.
And I suppose I'll direct this one to Dan. I mean, in terms of the impact for passengers, the immediate, again, that's quite a traumatic experience to go through, isn't it? Luckily, no one was seriously injured that we know. Obviously, no one was killed, thank goodness. But the potential for that sort of thing to happen,
Sure.
It's lucky that no one was injured.
Yeah. Tim's absolutely right. Obviously, this is going to raise very serious concerns about quality control. There's a reason why we have redundancy systems in aviation. In case somebody misses something, somebody else catches it. The supervisor's there. Maybe the bolts were not torqued, as Tim said, to the proper calibration that they were supposed to be, which we'll find out. And so, yes, it can be very alarming, but I would also add this to the conversation. I think this also highlights one other thing, and that is how safe aviation is. If you think of the thousands of flights that take place every single day, safely, nothing happens. And I think what happens is when we have these isolated incidents, which fortunately are very few, they're magnified with the public, right? Because they so rarely happen. And so everybody, gets kind of worked up about it. Oh, I'm never going to fly again, or I'm not going to sit in, I think, what was it, seat 26A or something like that, and whatever it was. And so I think it also speaks to how safe this industry is and how safe commercial air travel is. And the structural integrity of these planes, both Boeing and Airbus. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Also, what will happen is obviously this is going to go through, the media, through analysis. We'll get a report. Right now, a lot of passengers are worked up, but once the smoke kind of goes away, I think people will get back to feeling fairly safe about air travel, simply because this is just an isolated incident. And we'll certainly find out, if, as Tim said, if this was just, an installation problem or a structural error that needs to be remedied, we'll do that. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that air travel still is very, very safe. And so people should feel free to pick whatever seat they like. If they want to sit in the exit row, you can sit in the exit row. If you want to sit in the front, fine. I think they're all relatively safe.
And Tim, if I could just go back to you, you're a civil attorney. Are passengers going to be entitled to be making lawsuits or claims against Boeing or Alaska Airlines, or is there any kind of case for passengers to be making, because of what happened, but also because of what potentially could have happened, risk to life?
Sure. Before I answer that question, I just want to agree with Dan. Commercial aviation is extremely safe, and but it's important that we hold the manufacturers to a high standard. So when something like this happens, when we see that they maybe were cutting corners in quality control, or when there's a breakdown in quality control, because it may not have been something that happened on purpose. It's important that we hold them to a high standard, because when something goes wrong with these aircraft, it can be very catastrophic. And thankfully, in this case, it wasn't catastrophic and nobody was seriously injured. And the pilots who were handling this aircraft did a fantastic job, and they got the aircraft safely to the ground, and everybody walked off. And that's an excellent point that needs to be made. Now, as far as what the passengers on the aircraft, what is their course of action after experience something like this? We can imagine that, especially for people who might be a little nervous about flying, when everything goes right, when the door comes off, essentially the door flies off and you have a gaping hole in the aircraft, it could be terrifying. People literally thought that they were not going to be returning to the airport, that they might be crashing, and this could be the end of their lives. And that's a very serious emotional event to go through. And so there is a path for these passengers to seek compensation for that. And they will contact lawyers and they will talk to them about what their rights are, having gone through this. The truth is that something went wrong along the way. Somebody is, and someone's responsible for allowing this to happen. A job, a responsibility wasn't fulfilled, and people went through very traumatic experience. Thankfully, it's not, we're not dealing with the death of any passengers or the serious injuries, but they do have that right to go and say, I shouldn't have had to experience this. And this could change their lives. They may not want to fly again. Dan mentioned some people may not want to sit in certain seats. Some people may not want to get on an airplane after that kind of experience. So they do have that right.
So we're looking at potentially, a case for emotional, mental trauma. That's the kind of civil side of it. You kind of just suggested there that somebody might be to blame. Are we looking at a potential criminal, investigation with regards to, malpractice, someone not actually doing their job properly? Is there, liability there, in a court of law?
I would say that civil litigation is probably the main area, but that's not the decision. That's not a decision I make. That's the government, the FAA, federal prosecutors. They would have to go in and find some gross negligence, someone who made a decision ignoring ignoring the real danger that would be created by their actions, for it to be raised to a criminal criminal level, so to speak. So I wouldn't expect that to happen. But with the history of Boeing's issues with the MAX aircraft, and maybe some issues with people cutting corners for the purpose of maybe increasing profit margin, those kinds of things, that's what they'll look into, and some federal prosecutor will make a decision. I personally think probably it will only be civil litigation that arises, if at all.
And Dan, talking, you've just mentioned there, Tim, the particular model, there have been issues with it before. Surely this is ringing alarm bells now. There have been several instances with this particular model with things going wrong. As you say, the FAA have grounded, I think you said, over 100 of these aircraft types. Why was it granted the ability to be flying again when obviously there are other issues with it, as we've, seen from Friday's incident?
Right. We have had a number of issues with this type of aircraft. I believe it began with computer software issues. We had a couple plane crashes where unfortunately a large number of people died with it. And so Boeing had to come up with a fix. And they did. They came up with a kind of I believe it was a 2-hour training session for pilots flying the MAX 9 series. And so they're able to fix that. And then now they have this. I think what it comes down to is the partnership between aircraft manufacturing and airline needs. We've had a whole series of different aircraft, but what has been happening is the airlines obviously are looking at their expenses, they're looking at their profit margins, so they're trying to find the most valuable aircraft they can possibly have. And so what's been happening is, with the new technology, better engines, trying to save the cost of fuel, for example, they've basically been taking the 737 and stretching it as far as they possibly can. There comes a point where that can be aerodynamically potentially problematic when you stretch it too far. And so you have to ask the question, well, why is Boeing designing these planes, or they're really trying to stretch an aircraft. Or maybe you might have something like the 757, which can seat 180 to 220 people. But airlines are trying to save money. But you can certainly ask, well, why don't you stop, for example, after you made the 800 series and then focus on refining the 757? So that's all part of the partnership between the airlines and the aircraft manufacturers. And so I think that's something that they're definitely going to look at. I mean, 30, 40 years ago, nobody would have thought you could fly a 737 from Seattle to Honolulu, because those planes are designed for short haul flights. Southwest Airlines, their niche market is 500 miles, and the 737 is perfect. So I think they're definitely going to look at that. But perhaps it might have been wiser for Boeing to say, let's re-examine this, and maybe let's not try to stretch the aircraft any further, and we'll just focus on a different series, like I said, like the 757 or 767, whatever it's going to be.
Well, look, thank you both very much for your time this morning for you, this afternoon for me. It's been great to have you on the show. I guess we'll just have to see, what future developments we have with the ongoing story. But I imagine it's going to be a very interesting investigation. So thank you very much, Daniel Bubb and Timothy Loranger.